Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of CRNA School Prep Academy podcast. I am your host, Jenny Fennell in CRNA. Welcome back to the show. Today, we are going to cover the GRE. So this is a very hated test, including myself included, I should say. The GRE, it's a standardized test. A lot of schools, luckily, are going away from requiring the GRE. However, there are some who still require it, or they only require it if you don't meet certain expectations with their GPA. So we're going to kind of cover that today and what kind of to expect. I will just say that, if you're someone who doesn't do well with standardized tests, like I said, that was me. I had to take the GRE a couple different times. Don't be afraid to pay for tutoring, and maybe even just start off with tutoring. That's probably what I should have done. I know historically some of the stuff that was tested on, including math, was something that I struggled with learning when I was younger. And so essentially when I went to take the GRE, I was trying to study math that I never had learned correctly from the beginning. So it was really hard for me to teach myself math that I never really truly ever grasped from the beginning. And so I struggled with the GRE when I first took it myself. I wouldn't say I did terrible the first time I took it. I don't remember my exact score. I just know it was less than a 300. I want to say it was right around a 295-ish score kind of thing. Or maybe it was even higher. I don't remember. It was between 295 and 300, but it wasn't 300. And all I can remember is the fact that one of the schools I was going to apply to required a 300, for the GRE, which is pretty standard to require a 300 minimum score. And I called to see if I could still apply because I barely missed the 300. And it was a academic advisor. It was for the program, for the anesthesia program. And they actually laughed at me over the phone and kind of got snarky and said, well, if you can't meet at least a 300, you shouldn't even bother applying. And I was like, whoa, okay, well, yikes, ouch. Like that hurt. So I was like, well, I guess I'm getting a tutor because I'm definitely not going to do it on my own. And I did. I invested probably over $1,000 and went to a class 3 days a week. I remember I worked night shift as a nurse, and I would have to go to these GRE classes at 8 a.m. in the morning after my shift and sit in these classes till like about noon, and then barely get any sleep and go back into work that night. It was rough. And I did that for probably six weeks or so. I did that just before I took it again for the second time. But then I got I did good enough on the second time around, I boosted my quantitative score so much that I actually had a very good score after that. And I want to say it was, and again, I don't remember the exact numbers. I just know it was right around a 311. I think my score ended up being after I had paid for the tutoring. And it was all because of my quantitative score, which is the math score, essentially. Like my verbal didn't even budge. And my verbal was always a little bit below average. And I was like, whatever. I mean, let's just be honest. I don't have a great verbal. I don't even like to read books, just so you know. I'm not a book reader. I like to listen to things on audio, but I hate reading. The reading's never been something that I like to do. The physical task of reading is like something that I hate, actually. So anyhow, like I said, don't be afraid to pay for tutoring. And I say, based on what your score was if you took it initially and didn't do as well as you want, pick an area of focus. Meaning if your quantitative score is already average, maybe just focus on your verbal section or wherever your area of that you think you can improve upon the most. What I have heard from the tutors that I remember when I was seeking out tutoring advice, they did say it's much easier to improve your quantitative score than it is to improve your verbal score. And essentially it's because the verbal is so vast. And essentially if you don't have the knowledge when you go to take the verbal section, it's going to be really hard to quickly cram all that information in, but you can quickly relearn math. So it's much easier to improve your quantitative score. So just keep that in mind. I almost think you want to as long as you're scoring right around average on verbal, I wouldn't worry about improving that score. Just make sure you don't get way worse, but just focus on your quantitative section, to improve upon. So before I get into much more, I'm going to go ahead and start from the beginning where I had intended to start with this episode. And so what do schools want? Okay. All schools are a little different. Like I said, some only require the GRE if, say, your GPA is less than a 3.4. Some, their cutoff's a 3.5. Some schools will have a cutoff of a 3.2. So again, knowing what your school requires as far as, GRE, GPA requirements is where you need to start. If you don't need to take the GRE, don't take it. Don't just take it to take it. I'm actually shocked when some students come at me and say, hey, my school doesn't require the GRE, but do you think it'll boost my application? I'm like, first of all, are you nuts? Like, you actually want to take the GRE when they don't even require it? I wouldn't do that. I mean, I know I say in other things, if it's not required, it's usually not recommended. It's not like they say, I recommend the GRE. They just say either they require it or they don't require it based on if you have a GPA that's, 3.5 or higher, then don't take the GRE. And it just, so if that's your school and you're thinking, well, what if I took the GRE and I have a 3.7, would it boost my application? I wouldn't do that. Because a couple things. One, it's probably not going to, they don't even require it for a GPA that's that high and you don't need it. It's really not a good predictor of success, to be quite honest. And these schools, I think, only do it as like kind of a, well, their GPA is kind of shaky. They care more about your GPA. Let's just say that from the very beginning. GPA has always historically been statistically a better predictor of your success in school than the GRE. And they know this. They flat out know this. There is studies on this. In fact, I just found a study by Advent Health in Florida, who literally just published this article, or it's more like a paper essentially, about the GRE as a poor predictor of passing the NCE on the first attempt. The NCE is the National Certification Exam, in case that abbreviation threw some of you off. So again, if you have a high GPA, do not think the GRE is going to be a booster. It's not meant to be as such. It's more meant to be an extra requirement if your GPA, which is a good predictor, is on the lower end. It's one more way of them being like, okay, well, their GREs or their GPA is a little on the lower end than what we normally accept, and it makes us nervous. But look, they have a 310 on their GRE and their quantitative score is high. Their quantitative kind of correlates to math and science. So that's why quantitative sometimes is what they care the most about. And not that they want you to be terrible at verbal, but as long as you score average on verbal, most schools like to see a high quantitative score because it's a better indication of how you will perform in your science curriculum during the program. So just a piece of advice there. But yeah, don't just take it to take it thinking it's going to boost your application. Because another thing too is that what if you do bad? Like, then you have to report your score. And if you didn't do well, it's like, if you have it, you have to report it. If you don't have it, just leave it away. You know what I mean? But a lot of schools will say, well, if you have it, report it, but we don't require it. See what I'm saying? So like, that's not a position you want to be in, especially if you are not required to have it, but you didn't do well. Now you have to report it, So again, only worry about taking it if you absolutely need it for a school that you want to apply to. But again, if you know yourself best, try studying for it. If you take some practice tests and you don't get the score you want, before you actually take it for the real attempt, that's recorded score, just get a tutor from the very beginning. That's what I wish I would have done instead of even trying it on my own. I would have saved myself time, because I had to retake it. I missed the application deadline for another school. So that's why I'm like, okay, so just, I don't know, save yourself the headache. If you know yourself, get a tutor from the very beginning. There are some tutoring companies that will give you a money back guarantee if you do not get the score you want. I think they probably make you be realistic. Like, you probably can't say, I want a 328, but if your goal is a 300, and let's say even if you've never taken it before, I think a 300 is a pretty reasonable place to be, as that's average. But let's just say you took it and you got a 295. I think it's pretty safe to say that with tutoring, you can boost it to a 300. And I think they should be able to guarantee that. So look for tutoring companies who can do that. That might save you some stress of spending some extra money on tutoring if at least the score is guaranteed. Okay, back to on topic. So schools and GRE. The schools that require it will say 300. Now, some say 295. I think I've even seen a school that says 294, but that's the lowest I've ever seen as far as minimum requirement. Now, just like everything, the minimum GPA requirement is a 3.0 as well. It doesn't mean that most students get in with a 3.0, right? So same with the GRE. They say 300 or 295 is the minimum, if that's what your school says. To be competitive, you need higher than that. Now, some schools with a GRE is a little different than GPA, because some schools, even though they might require the GRE, it's not a big predictor of success, and they know that. So even if you just met the minimum at a 300, don't worry. I'm not trying to scare you guys. I'm not trying to say you have to get better than a 300, but in the terms of competitiveness, a competitive GRE score is probably above a 305. Some schools will say if you have a lower GPA, like maybe a 3.1, 3.0, they like to see a GRE of a 311 would be what they like to see. So they could say, okay, their GREs or the GPA is pretty low, but look how high their GRE is. So what I mean? But I also think if you're suffering from a low GPA, you're probably still better off just taking some current graduate level science courses and getting A's in those courses versus trying to kill yourself to get a 311 on the GRE. But by all means, if you feel like you could take the GRE and do well, then by all means do that. So anyhow, so like I said, getting a 300 on the GRE is good. Okay. I'm not saying you have to worry about getting a 311 or anything like that. But if you think your GPA is on the borderline, try for higher than 300. Try for at least 305 would be what I would recommend if your GPA is probably less than a 3.4. Okay. That would be my recommendation. That's only if they require the GRE. If they don't require it, if your school's saying, not only do I not require it, but even if you have a lower GPA, I still don't require it. Don't just take the GRE. I still think your time and money would be better spent taking a graduate level course and getting an A if that's the case. Okay. I just wanted to start, but don't even do that until you've at least touched base with your school. Don't just go sign up for a course. Make sure always you touch base with your program first. Make sure that at least the course you're taking is something they actually want to see you take based on your transcript review. Because what if you took a stats course, but really they would have rather you taken or have you take a physics course or a chemistry course, so make sure that, again, if you're going to be taking courses, you have some kind of direction on what course to take from your school or from a faculty member doing a transcript review, like in the CRNA School Prep Academy. Richard Wilson will do a transcript review for you and give you some guidance as far as if you were to take a graduate level course, what courses would be best for you based on what your grades are in your science courses currently. So all right, enough on that spiel. Back to the GRE. So that's kind of as far as scoring goes. Again, 300 is the minimum. If your school only requires a 295, I still would probably shoot for a 300, but know that if you got the minimum, it's different than just getting the minimum on the GPA. It's probably not as detrimental to get a minimum GRE score as it is a minimum GPA score. Because again, the GPA is a better predictor of success than the GRE. But that being said, you should always try more than the minimum when you're applying to CRNA school. That's just a standard. Always try aim for more than the minimum, always. And again, to be really competitive with the GRE, you are looking at above a 305. Okay. Just going to put it out there. Now, as far as breaking down verbal, analytical writing, and quantitative, I'm going to give you some numbers. These are just numbers based on everyone who takes the test. I'm not just talking about CRNA students, because unfortunately there's no data that exists on just CRNA school students. At least I don't have access to, if there is, I can't read you what the average analytical score is of a CRNA student, that kind of thing. But anyhow, so nationally, the average on the verbal section, which means in the 50th percentile, is a 151. So 151 is in the 50th percentile for the verbal reasoning score. In the 51st percentile, which is the closest to 50th they gave me on this chart, for the quantitative section is a score of a 154. So if you put those two scores together, you're looking at a 305. Okay. So 305, how I just said 305 is competitive. That's average, you guys. That is average. That's a competitive score for CRNA school, is being average on the GRE. Okay. Anything above that is above average. Anything below that is below average. And so as you can see, some of these schools who are taking it a 295, for example, they're actually willing to accept a much lower than average score for the GRE if that's the case. And so just to put it in perspective, if you were to get a 147 on your verbal reasoning section, a 147, you're in the 32nd percentile, 32nd. Okay. And then if you were to get a 147 on the quantitative section, you're actually in the 25th percentile for quantitative. That's pretty low. So those two scores combined is a 294. So as you can see, 32% and 25% is much lower than the national average as far as everyone who takes this test. It's something to be ashamed about, you guys. I did the same thing. I mean, this is a hard test, and standardized tests suck. Okay. I'm just going to say it. They suck. And it doesn't mean that you're stupid or not smart enough. I mean, it has no indication of how well you're going to perform in anesthesia school. None, zero, zip, zilch, nothing. But it's a hoop. It's a hoop you have to jump through to get accepted into CRNA school. It's unfortunate. I love the fact that a lot of schools are going away from it. I love the fact that there's been numerous studies that indicate that the GRE is not a good predictor of success. I myself had struggled with the ACT, SAT just to get into college. But I, my freshman year, I didn't do great in college, but I ended up getting straight A's from my sophomore year in college on, and I did not do well on the ACT or SAT. So boom, that goes out the window, right? So these standardized tests really have no indication of how well you're going to perform academically, but all things being said, these schools are evaluating you from numerous points. Okay. They're looking at ICU experience, GPA, leadership experience, volunteer experience, even, or personality characteristics, GRE. They're looking at everything and seeing if we had to piece together this applicant, how well do we think they're going to do in our program based on all these puzzle pieces, right? And the GRE is one of those puzzle pieces. And so I don't think it's a huge weighted factor, but it still goes into everything. So I just don't feel bad about your GRE score. And that's not the intent of this episode at all. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's just, I hope this episode will make you realize just how silly the GRE is and how you shouldn't feel bad about it if you don't do well on it. But unfortunately it is what it is. And you have to at least do average on it in order to apply to school and meet that requirement. And like I said, the one school I wanted to apply to laughed at me when I said I had I don't remember if it was a 294 or it was less than a 300, and they laughed at me, and told me not to bother applying. So that's kind of what you're up against. It stinks. There's nothing in life that's fair. Let's just put it that way. I mean, it's not fair, but nothing in life is fair. So it's either you do it or you don't, and you just don't apply. And again, kind of like everything I say with applying to school, CRNA school, these schools don't have to make exceptions. They have so many applicants who meet these requirements. They don't have to make exceptions for people who don't. It's not like they have, 50 applicants, and out of those 50 applicants, 25 of them, don't meet their requirements. All 50 probably meet their requirements. And there might be a few outliers who don't, or, so they have plenty of people to pick from to interview. So yeah, unfortunately, it's just a really crappy part of my French. I probably should beep that one out. It's a really not so nice and not so fun test. Is that better? All right. But I also wanted to, again, let you guys know that the GRE, again, there has been studies on it. And if you look up Advent Health, March 2021, GRE, I don't even know what I Googled. I think I just Googled nurse anesthesia, GRE score, NCE pass rate. I think that's what I Googled. And I came up with this. I found this article that was just written by Advent Health, which is a CRNA program that if you read through, there's a lot of statistics in there. But essentially, long story short, because it's like 11 or 12 pages long, and I read it all. So you're welcome. It wasn't fun. It's simply, long story short, that the GPA is a much better indicator of success as far as passing the boards, the nurse anesthesia boards the first time than GRE. And again, I think this is pretty well known in the community as well, but it still doesn't change the fact that some schools require the GRE. Some schools only require the GRE if your GPA is at a certain level. And so as of August 2020, it stated this in the article. I didn't do this research, but this article, whoever wrote the article did the research on this, but out of 122 schools, I believe there's 124 schools currently. So this is a year old, but 100, out of 122 schools, 52 of them did not require the GRE. Okay, that's 42%. 42% of the schools do require the GRE. So less than half of the schools still require the GRE. So again, we are trending in that direction where schools are eliminating that because again, they're not seeing the usefulness and the predictor factor of it. Out of those 52 schools, 12 of them that require the GRE, 12 of them actually waive the GRE if you meet other expectations, like the GPA marker. Okay, did I say that correctly? So 52 schools require the GRE out of 122. That's 42%. And out of those 52, 12 will waive the GRE if the expectations, other expectations are hit, like the marker of the GPA. And again, the quantitative score has been more historically accurate if you're looking at data to be more of a predictor of how well you would do in your anesthesia classes. So if you were going to focus on any one thing, I would say the quantitative section, and I've also heard that's the easiest section to boost your score in, is where I would put your focus and your studying at. Not saying you want to neglect verbal, but you want to at least be average, shooting for average in verbal. And then let's briefly talk about the analytical writing. They will say, most schools will say 3.5 is the minimum for that. Some will actually say 4 is the minimum. 4 is average. 4 is like in the 55th percentile, where a 3.5 is in the 38th percentile. So again, whether you score a 3.5 or a 4, you know, they want it between that range, which is somewhat average. Okay. Pretty big jump to go from a 3.5 to a 4 between 38%, 55%. So the average lies somewhere in the middle. Okay. So that's why they sometimes will say a 3.5 because I know the average is between a 3.5 and a 4. I think a 4 would probably be better considering now that these programs are D&P programs, you're going to be doing a lot of writing. So I think if you did get a 4 or even higher, I think they would like to see that because it would indicate that you're a good writer, you're above average. I don't think schools would, you know, as long as you're meeting the minimum, if their minimum is a 3.5, I don't think they're going to, you know, it's not going to make or break you, whether you have a 3.5 or a 4, if their minimum's a 3.5, if that makes sense. Now, but if you have less than a 3.5 and their minimum's a 3.5, that is a big deal because it's the same thing going back to the 300 as their minimum between quantitative and verbal reasoning. You still have to meet the minimum of the writing score as well. So, you know, and I see a lot of students who maybe English is their second language struggle with this, which is unfortunate. I really, you know, that stinks. It's just really, I mean, again, back to the whole unfairness. It's just not fair because this is a standardized English test, you know, and probably has nothing to do with how well you could probably speak or even articulate. But someone who learned English as their second language is going to have a much harder time writing to these standards than someone who has grown up with English their whole life. So if that's you, you know, seek out guidance early on, seek out counseling or tutoring early on to try to help you with that, to overcome that barrier. And ultimately, long story short too, you guys, is if this is really is a game breaker for you, where say you've taken this stupid test, I'm going to say it, stupid test over and over and over again, you get the same score and you're beating your head with a brick and you're like, I can't get a 300, then maybe consider going to a different school. Okay. Maybe consider opening the opportunity to consider a school that does not require it. Now, I know it's not always possible for you if you're stuck in your one location based on family or whatever else you have going on in your life. That is very unfortunate. At that point, then you're really stuck with no other option than to try to seek out professional help to improve your score. Because again, these schools are probably not going to waver on the fact that they require this because they can't make an exception for you and not everyone else. Even if the rest of your application is awesome, they usually will hold to their minimum requirement. But there are plenty of schools, like I said, over 50% of schools do not require the GRE. So maybe expand your window of opportunity and look for schools that don't require the GRE. I do know some students literally make it their initial mission to find a school that does not require the GRE because that's how much they would dread taking this test. They don't even want to take it. They just automatically X off all those schools who even require it, period, and don't even go there. So that's always an option there. Like I said, over 50% no longer require the GRE. So, all right. Well, I think that sums up the GRE for you guys. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you don't have to take the GRE, but if you do, I feel your pain. Best of luck, and you got this. And again, don't be afraid to reach out for help even prior to taking it. Know yourself the best. And if you need that extra extra time with a tutor, I say just go from the start, or maybe again, take some practice tests first and see how you do. And if you don't get the score you were hoping, then just go for the tutor before you actually pay for the real test. Because that's not cheap either. Nothing about this whole process is cheap. So everything's expensive. The CCRN is expensive. The GRE is expensive. So you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward from the beginning, so you're not having to retake this expensive, awful, awful test. All right. Well, you guys take care. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next week.